it's not just one era, it's not just one specific genre. It's now a multi-century history of relationships between these two peoples who have had parallel stories of oppression, parallel stories of lacking opportunity, parallel stories of people around the world saying they love this music, but they don't accept the people. As a Jewish musician myself, I've always been deeply interested in the American musical vernacular and understanding how American popular music came to be and the ways in which it developed. And anybody who looks into that immediately recognizes that Black music is at the very heart and soul of the American cultural story, the American musical story. And that if you go back to the origins of Black music in America, stemming from slavery and then weaving its way through the end of the 19th century into the 20th century, every single part of American music making, American original art form is touched by the influence of Black music makers. And for some reason, and this is part of the interest in creating this new program that explores these relationships between Black and Jewish music making, but for some reason there's always been a fascination by Jewish composers, Jewish conductors, Jewish music makers in that story, in the kind of music that was made by Black musicians, and an interest more than just kind of a curious one in actually incorporating Black music into their own aesthetic, their own voices. And of course the names that come right to mind are Gershwin and Bernstein and Copland, all world-class Jewish American composers that directly brought Black music making into their own work. But that was just the start. We had this introspective summer, like I think every arts institution around the country in 2020, of figuring out what it means to be a large public-facing arts institution in the face of police brutality here in Louisville in light of the killing of Breonna Taylor. It was very real for us. And I think every institution that took an honest look at itself wanted to respond in a way that would support their own community, that would support moving forward in a more equitable way and being inclusive in a way that was true. There was a lot of, I think, decision making that maybe stemmed from fear. We saw a lot of institutions that made quick decisions about programming that I think probably maybe they came from a good place in some form, but I didn't feel that they were thought through. They weren't necessarily thoughtful, they weren't genuinely inclusive, they were just perhaps a quick fix or a quick way of waving a flag and saying we're on the right side. At the Louisville Orchestra, we really wanted to do something that was right, not just for the community now, but long term. And so we thought about how we could take the work that we'd already been doing in the equity space and thinking about how we could take the energy of being inclusive, which was so much a core part of our investment in artistic work these past few years, and do something that would make sustained impact, that would be not just inclusive, but actually transform the way our art connects with all people in our region and ultimately serve as a model beyond. And we had just come off of what I consider to be a really beautiful celebration through a different lens of equity when we hosted the Violins of Hope at the Louisville Orchestra. We had just had the Violins of Hope in the 2019-20 season, and those are of course violins that were originally used in concentration camps during the Holocaust. And these violins found their way eventually to America and make their kind of journey from city to city, where orchestras use the violins in performance and then create a program to tell a story about how those violins came to be today and what they symbolize. And I started thinking about then the connection between how powerful that concert was and my own identity as I said, a Jewish composer, deeply interested in Black culture and always having wanted to incorporate that into my own work, and then standing on the shoulders of many other Jewish composers who've done the same. And I realized that the connection between the Black experience and the Jewish experience extends far beyond just that kind of surface element of Porgy and Bess, or some of Bernstein's best known jazzy works. And I realized that it dates back to some of the beginning parts of musical history in America. From the onset, you had black musicians that had come here, or even just black people that had come here enslaved, that started using music as a way of maintaining a sense of community, of maintaining a sense of spirituality, and of creating hope. And of course, I'm talking about spirituals. Many spirituals, in fact, you might even say most spirituals, as it turns out, are derived from Old Testament themes. They're derived from the story of the Exodus. So there's already this deep, deep relationship between black people that came to America making music that's derived from the same kind of Jewish story of being freed from slavery, of Moses leading people out of enslavement and into freedom. And so you have this parallel track long before you get Jewish composers involved in this much more intricate way. You have this parallel track of kind of Jewish themes, of Old Testament themes connecting with and inspiring black music. And it only continues from there. After that, you start seeing natural relationships between composers, Jewish composers, on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean, inspired by black music. So it's now all of a sudden coming full circle. And yes, you get your Gershwins in America that want to write jazz. They love the energy of jazz. They're inspired by what they're seeing in Harlem. And Gershwin now suddenly wants to make it his own or contribute to it. Coming another kind of 180-degree cycle when you see him not only using that music in his own aesthetic, but then writing for it and creating the first all-black cast opera that's produced in a major setting in New York with Porgy and Bess. Then you start looking at Jewish composers in Europe, and you have this fascinating dynamic where many of the composers that would ultimately be either exiled, self-exiled because of the Nazi occupation, or they might in fact find their way in a concentration camp or a labor camp, before that happens, they are inspired by the energy of jazz. You have composers that are using the poetry of Langston Hughes, Jewish composers in Europe that are finding inspiration from that and writing settings of that. You have composers like Krennic and Schorhoff that are directly inspired by the energy of black popular music. They're writing ragtime and jazz. And so there's this deep connection that's formed, and that's the launch pad for so many other relationships, the dynamics of which sometimes are extremely positive and beautiful and are collaborative, and sometimes there are elements, especially on the business side, that have all kinds of other ramifications. But for me, exploring these two sides, especially the composers in Europe that would come to be either banned or forgotten, specifically because they were Jewish, and composers and musicians in America who were black that never got their fair stage because of who they were, creates this kind of parallel dynamic of some of the greatest talents in the 20th century in particular never having their proper due, never having the audiences that they deserved, not having, even if they did have big audiences, not having the kind of the official capacity that they should have had. Not being properly sanctioned by the big institutions that either shunned them or didn't give them the stage that they deserved. And our interest is in saying, if we're going to be an institution that faces history honestly, and faces history with the lens of saying we need to keep history alive so that we can learn from it and we can embetter ourselves, and also keep the storytelling alive that creates the world that we live in today. This is something that we can do really honestly. This is not just a quick fix for an equity problem. This is a deep topic to explore. It's my own personal history because coming from a long line of composers, if you look at my own kind of musical pedigree that have been involved in this kind of work directly, means that this is something that I feel like it speaks to my own life. And at the same time, I've been invested in black music deeply. I mean, one of the big pieces that I wrote was a rap opera about Muhammad Ali. I wasn't thinking about it through this lens, but here you go, another Jewish composer taking black iconic storytelling and music making and either using it or utilizing it or finding inspiration from it. So I've already been a part of this history. The great thing about this is that it has many facets. It's not just one era. It's not just one specific genre. It's now a multi-century history of relationships between these two peoples who have had parallel stories of oppression, parallel stories of lacking opportunity, parallel stories of people around the world saying they love this music, but they don't accept the people. And that's where we really want to delve deeply into saying, well, the people from the past that deserve the platform, we're going to give them that platform. But we're also going to elevate the whole dynamic between these two groups by studying it, by taking it seriously from a scholarship angle, by actually telling ourselves that this is a story that deserves to be told and deserves to be delved into very deeply. And so that's why it's not just a 1 week thing, it's not a 1 year thing. It's now going to be at least a 4-year project here that we're committing to do this in a way that's really fascinating. And the great thing about it is it means it's not just in the past, it's in the future. So we're talking about things like, say, an opera that was written in a concentration camp having an all-black cast, or vice versa. All kinds of things that establish new connections between these two groups of people that hopefully then strengthen them for the future.